Hello, good afternoon. Hi, welcome back. Hello. For those who remember from yesterday, I'm Stacey Abbott. I'm from Northumbria University. And I have to say, I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce this afternoon's film, David Cronenberg's VIDEODROME. As a Canadian growing up in the 70s and 80s, I was always aware of Cronenberg before I ever saw any of his films. I think the first film I ever saw of his was Scanners. Yes, big cheer for Scanners, which, and dare I say it, kind of blew my mind. You gotta say it. It was audacious, it was action-packed, it was gory, and this was not what I, as a young teenager, associated with Canadian cinema. It was not what I expected. At the time, this was a time when Canadian cinema was largely defined by the National Film Board of Canada, which was an institution that specialized in documentaries, educational films, animation. And then here you had this filmmaker not only making feature fiction films, but specializing in genre films, those disreputable genres of science fiction and horror. And he took them seriously. You know, he took it absolutely seriously as a filmmaker and what he was doing. Now, the horror fans in the audience will remind me that at the same time that Cronenberg was coming out and making his films in the 70s, there was a cycle of Canadian slasher films, which I, as a teenager, sort of became aware of later. But at the same time, what struck me at the time was that what Cronenberg was overtly Canadian in his sensibilities. These films were set in Canada, Canadian actors embraced their Canadianness. In a way, and they were highly original. They weren't part of any cycle, any trend. So they really stood out as quite different. Cronenberg mixes, sex, sexuality, violence, blood, gore, in a richly provocative ways. And as a result, his films demanded attention, enraged censors, and caused controversy. Again, things not usually associated with Canada. We're often seen to be that quiet, friendly nation. We offend no one. But Cronenberg offends everyone. His films were criticized by conservative censors and politicians who thought his work was a corrupting influence. But he was equally disliked by many left-wing film critics, like Robin Wood, famously, who thought his work was reactionary, particularly his depiction of sexuality. But Cronenberg was just determined to be himself and to be true to his visions. When critics tried to dismiss his work and question why he was getting government funding, because he had a lot of government support for his films, he was often criticized for making these exploitation films with Canadian money. But instead of backing down, he pushed back. And VIDEODROME is part of that pushback. VIDEODROME is the film he makes to say, okay, you think that my films are negative influences, you're concerned about this exploitation genre, so I'm going to make a film about that. I'm going to make a film that's actually going to think about the potential effect of sex and violence on audiences. But in true Cronenberg fashion, rather than simply making a film that kind of would be like an illustrated lecture of his particular take on the fact that, on the relationship between sex and violence and the potential impact, he made a film that actually really gets very complicated on that, in making VIDEODROME. How many people here have seen VIDEODROME before? Good. I figured we would probably be in a knowing audience for this. So as we all know, this is a film about, a somewhat unscrupulous TV producer who becomes himself obsessed with sadomasochism on screen, both for commercial exploitation and his own titillation. And then begins to be influenced by these images that he is watching, these very particular images he is watching on screen. And that's where it gets really interesting. It begins to cause hallucinations. It begins to cause violent behavior, or does it? What we see, do we know what's real or what not? And this is where the film is really unsettling, disturbing, and confrontational. Cronenberg at his best. Now, over the past few days, we've seen a lot of films with unreliable narrators, where we don't really trust their perspective. We've seen films that kind of begin to show the relationship between dreams and the waking state, dreams or reality, and maybe move back and forth between them. This is all the terrain of Videodrome. Cronenberg was playing with this in this film in deeply provocative ways, blurring the line between reality and hallucination, and making us question, what do we believe of our main protagonist, Max Wren? Do we believe anything he's saying? Who do we believe is the cause of this violence, these visions? Is it the right-wing politicians trying to manipulate him to show the effects of violence? Is it the left wing trying to challenge these assumptions? The film doesn't give us any easy answers in terms of that. It allows us to sit and think about how we feel about the effects debate. It also, in true Cronenberg fashion, includes some wonderful blurring of wonderful examples of body horror, kind of the blurring of body and technology, in a kind of exploring our inherent cyborgness in a way that feels in some ways ahead of its time. And it features, for the horror fans, outstanding makeup effects by Rick Baker on the heels of his Oscar win with American Werewolf in London. But with American Werewolf in London, he reached the pinnacle of his acceptance by the industry with Werewolf. With Cronenberg, suddenly they're pushing the boundaries of acceptability, pushing the boundaries of imagery that we get, lots of surreal, disturbing images. And I think Baker loved working on this type of material. He didn't know quite what Cronenberg was going to ask him to do next. The film invites us to question about the effects of violence, allows us to think about it, and it's something we can think about as we watch it. Cronenberg is a rare filmmaker whose name has become an adjective, for a certain type of horror. So to describe something as Cronenbergian, we know we're talking about a particular type of cold, visceral, grotesque body horror. His success opened the doors for many filmmakers who continue to work in similar traditions, both in Canada and beyond. So I think he created opportunities for people like Vincenzo Natali, the Soska sisters, Bruce McDonald, Brandon Cronenberg. Okay, he opened doors for Brandon Cronenberg in many ways. And of course, most recently, Coralie Forgit's The Substance, I think, is highly Cronenbergian. And I wanted to end this introduction with a quote from the man himself, where he was once asked about his work, and he said, "My films are entertainment in the fullest sense. I'd like people to entertain my films rather than my films to entertain them. So please, I'd like you to sit back and entertain this most Cronenbergian of Cronenberg's films. And in the spirit of the film, long live the new flesh."